thank you very much for your encouraging words, and I think this is the best chance for us today to get together to discuss the main theme of this conference and also to see the reflections of the 3 experts we managed to invite here to Bad Homburg. One colleague of us is unfortunately missing. I regret that. Our colleague, Professor Dr. Nimet Şeker, she is unfortunately ill today, and this is why she will be missed today. Other than that, I will just give you some direction to our podium discussion today. So we have 3 main themes of the panel. The first theme is the idea which we will discuss together with Professor Dr. Wieland. It revolves around the trends in methods and approaches in the study of the Quran and the investigation, or rather exploration, of its genuine meaning by the Muslim exegetes of the 20th century. The second theme will go deeper in that we will look into the innovative methods and approaches in trying to reconstruct the Quran and its context, the context of the 7th century Arabia, and reflect together with Professor Dr. Ibrahim Musa about his critique or his reflections on one of the major scholars in the field of Quranic studies. The name of the author will come in a minute. The third theme is going to address some issues related to the establishment of Islamic theology at German universities and the potential contributions of Muslim theologians to the study of theology in a global context, of theology as an academic field of study. I would hope that every colleague sitting here to get the chance of 20 minutes to reflect and react to the question that I'm going to ask, and we hope that at the end of it we get the chance that the audience will raise some questions necessary. Yeah, so join me now in welcoming our 3 distinguished experts in the area of Quranic studies. Professor Dr. Rotraud Belnat, Professor of Islamic Studies, previously at the University of Otto Friedrich University, Bamberg. Professor Dr. Ibrahim Musa, Professor in Islamic Thought and Muslim Societies at the University of Notre Dame. And our colleague, dear colleague, Professor Dr. Felix Korner, Chair for Theology of Religions at the Institute of Catholic Theology at the Humboldt University in Berlin. Welcome, and we will begin now with the first question. Yeah, excuse me, I wouldn't be able to master any language, even my own mother tongue language nowadays, so I apologize. So, Professor Wieland, in your doctoral thesis, you investigated the attempts of Muslim thinkers, especially their attempts to interrelate revelation and history to each other. And later, you published an article on the exegesis of the Quran, early, modern, and contemporary, which you outlined in your article. Could you tell us what are the main trends in exegetical methods and their protagonists as observed in your examination of modern Muslim exegetes?
Well, there are really very interesting new approaches. First of all, I think it is no more appropriate nowadays to make a clear distinction between Muslim approaches on the one hand and modern theories of interpretation on the other hand, because we have important new approaches developed by Muslim scholars which are in fact modern in a double sense. That means, first, insofar as they are based on developments in the fields of theory of law interpretation, for instance, or philosophical hermeneutics that stem from the 20th century. For instance, someone like Fazlur Rahman based his theory of a double movement in the interpretation of Quranic legal norms on the approach of Emilio Betti concerning legal interpretation, or someone like Mehmet Pachaji and other thinkers of the so-called School of Ankara made use of the philosophical hermeneutics of Hans-Georg Gadamer. But even earlier, the whole school of literary interpretation of the Quran, which was initiated by Amin al-Khuli in Egypt and continued by some of his students, was based on recent developments in the interpretation of literary texts, and also an approach like that of Nasr Hamid Abu Zaid made use of a theory, a general theory of communication that was developed in the middle of the 20th century. That means that all these approaches are not thinkable without their basis in really contemporary theories. But they are also modern in another respect, namely all of them are aware of the importance of not only historically contextualizing what is said in the Quran, and of the importance of taking account of the whole cultural and social setting in which the speech of the Quranic revelation, as it is believed by Muslims, was really announced. But they are also aware of the necessity of recontextualizing the kernel, the main message, the purpose, the intention contained in Quranic verses with respect to what they mean for nowadays Muslims. And all of these approaches stem from a keen awareness, well, of the big historical difference between the conditions as they existed, cultural and social conditions as they existed at the time of the Prophet, and the social and cultural conditions in which Muslims have to live their religion nowadays. This is something typically modern.
Yeah, thank you. But I have a question also on that point you've just mentioned. You've mentioned Amin al-Khuli, and you mentioned also Nasr Hamid Abu Zaid, and both of them belong to the Egyptian context with some years of difference. So do you see any continuity with the work of Amin al-Khuli in Nasr Hamid Abu Zaid, or do you think that Nasr Hamid Abu Zaid, he just went beyond what was tolerable in Azhari context, Egyptian context?
Well, what Amin al-Khuli did, and what some of his students did later, famous Muhammad Ahmad Khalafallah, was also not considered as tolerable in the Egyptian context. Khalafallah lost his job at the university because of what he had developed. And
his wife.
yeah, yes. But of course, Nasser Hamid Abu Zaid developed his own approach in a more general context. It's a generalization of what was already contained in Amin al-Khuli's approach. And I think for this reason, it was a bigger provocation for his environment. But nevertheless, he never gave up the conviction that the Quran is verbally God's revelation. Insofar, some of the accusations raised against him were simply not fair.
Thank you. My question now, the next one goes to Ibrahim Musa. You have been one of the really few voices which raised critique to the approaches of Fazlur Rahman. Could you elaborate a little bit on what were your thoughts about his approach, which was celebrated by many, many modernists and reformists?
Thank you very much, and let me just thank Professor Orso and Professor Sardar and all the organizers for inviting me here. It's really great. I'm looking forward to it in a couple of days and also learning from my panelists. Thank you to you as chair. Yeah, so, I've been kind of, when I left the madrasas after studying in India, I basically gave up on the Islamic tradition as a tradition until I read Fazlur Rahman, the book Islam, and then I understood that this tradition does have a history and so on. So Fazlur Rahman in many ways inspired me to understand the tradition historically. Now, as you know that, Fazlur Rahman's, you're referring to my introduction to the new edition of his major themes of the Quran, in which I do give him kudos for, for raising important questions about the centrality of the Quran, but I was really troubled by two things. One is that Fazlur Rahman wants to make the Quran the logos of modern Islam. And that kind of logocentric approach, the Quran as the logos, is problematic insofar as that how does one then also think about the question of history and the Quran as a historical teaching and document, but also the question of tradition. Now, all those questions Fazlur Rahman had addressed. He has addressed the question of tradition. He has a critique of the, what he calls a commentarial tradition. He thinks the commentarial tradition is encyclopedic, but it is not innovative, right? And he's looking for innovation. Therefore, he latches on to scholars that he thinks are innovative in Islamic thought, people like Shah Waliullah, from time to time Ahmad Sirhindi, at other times Ibn Taymiyyah and Ghazali, and so on and so forth. So he goes around in the tradition to find those kind of innovative moments for his project. The other thing that he does is the question of, in this logocentric approach that he wants, which is I think an Iqbalian inspiration, Muhammad Iqbal's inspiration, he obviously critiques the hadith materials, or the sunnah rather, very severely, but he does believe there's a notion of sunnah. But the sunnah is not identical to hadith, but actually it is the hadith subjected to a very, very extensive historical and complex critique from which you can extrapolate the living sunnah, where he's much more closer to Malik. So when it comes to his double movement theory that he elaborates in, and Professor, the speaker before me just mentioned that double movement theory in major themes of, in Islam and modernity, at first blush, it looks interesting until you look at it much more closer, then you realize that it's not really, really helpful. So what Fazl Rahman says that, first move that you do is that you study the micro and macro context in which the Quran was first revealed. And so, but he did not have in front of him, one didn't see him deal in great complexity. So I think what Fazl Rahman really gave us was basically some kind of, provocations, but that work of what that Quranic micro and macro context is, he didn't work on it, nor did one see him drawing on other people's work who did that. And perhaps now with, materials on Islam in late antiquity, Professor Al-Azma and other scholars are doing, maybe that will now become a much more helpful tableau. Obviously, the materials that you had from Orientalist scholars was always tinged by a certain kind of attitude that was not always entirely helpful. And so clearly the question then was, how does one go about that? So I know Fazl Rahman, so that's the first movement. And his idea of establishing the original meaning of revelation within a moral social context of the prophetic society and the broader picture. Now, in order to draw this, this picture of the moral social context of the prophetic society requires again a certain historical depth. And Fazl Rahman does not elaborate it, but he states it only. And the other question then he moves on to, and what he expects from that, on the same first point, he expects that such an investigation must yield a coherent Quranic narrative of the general and systematic principles and values underlying the various normative injunctions. Now, this idea of developing principles is a very, very modern idea. It reminds me of a recent text of Al-Juwayni that I read. Al-Juwayni says that the Prophet developed qawa'id and usul, which is also a back projection. Now, one of the people who was critical on back projection was Fazl Rahman. Fazl Rahman always said that projecting the hadith back onto that, he was always concerned about this back projection of materials onto the early community when it was of a later development. So the question really becomes, how does one access this, prophetic society and its complexities and these normative values? Our source for that is history. And the question is, how big and how broad is your tableau for history, and what kind of historical materials are you going to use? Now, obviously, from the earlier conversation of Professor Scholler's lecture, we all know about the kind of concerns that a certain type of scholarship who made a name for itself by studying Islamic materials but always rejected those materials as authentic. So that obviously, now that is now passing, and it seems that Scholler and Motzki and others are coming around to think that Muslims told them 1,000 years ago that these sources are okay, we can work with it. But people, there's a good thing for late arrivals too. The second thing is, the second movement entails, of Fazl Rahman, an attempt to apply those general and systematic values and principles to the context of the contemporary reader of the Quran, and to make sense of the second movement, namely the application of the historical values, he argues requires sophisticated analysis. In the first movement of the micro and macro context, he talks about asbab al-nuzul, occasions of revelation, nasikh wal-mansukh, the question of abrogation, and so on and so forth. Now, when I think about this contribution, I think about it, it is very much a certain kind of, more sophisticated version of the analogical-based, qiyas-based analysis that he did. And that I think that sometimes, even though he invokes history a great deal, Fazl Rahman does not accomplish the historical work. And at times his enthusiasm as a reformer, precedes him rather than him necessarily doing the work. Or maybe, he was busy hoping that he would write something more on this historical question. The other thing that I've also noticed after studying Fazl Rahman very carefully is that, his early work was on philosophy, Ibn Sina in particular, and so on. But in his later work, even though when he comes to the US, after 10 years in the US, he publishes a book on Mullah Sadra, But neither Mullah Sadra nor Ibn Sina comes back in a substantial way in his later work, whether it's in the Quran and so on. Sometimes it does come back, but maybe as a footnote, as a reference, but nothing substantially, especially for someone like Fazl Rahman, who was very much interested in this question of epistemology. I mean, if you want to do an epistemology that would have some cachet with Muslims, that if you could build the bridge between contemporary times through your Ibn Taymiyyah, Ghazali, Ibn Sina, it would have been a remarkable kind of work, but he never got to it. But I think the idea of method and as you said, the question of the trends and methods, I think that was most interesting. But neither Fazl Rahman and nor some of his admirers took that much more seriously is this question of prophecy and the psychology of revelation. The idea of Muhammad as a human being with a certain kind of psyche, and that what the revelation does to the Muhammad psyche, and that he describes him as a shy person, as someone that was not very outspoken and so on, but as he accumulates this responsibility as a Nadhir, as a warner, then later on as a Nabi and a Rasul, as his prophetic persona grows, he develops certain kind of traits, which I think is a very, very interesting historical experiment and a way to understand history through a certain kind of psychology of the object to whom revelation was given and through whom the Quran becomes the kind of source document, at least one source document. So I disagree with Muslim modernists who just want to make the Quran the be-all and end-all of that, because there is no Quran without Muhammad. Unless you are Joseph Smith, that believe the Quran can be just put on some place and then you have, a different kind of religion.
But how can we do it then? You're just trying to make another suggestion, focusing only on the Quran, yes. Taking maybe also the focus on the personality of the Prophet and his psychology.
Yeah, so I think that here we require more historical studies. For instance, Fazl Rahman argues that the Prophet, that the very idea of revelation is not as mechanical as the Muslim tradition suggested it is. That an angel came and tutored the Prophet and then he regurgitates that. He thinks it's much more complex, and to put it in very short terms, that Muhammad receives, as he puts it, idea words, and then from his idea words, there are sound words that comes out of that. So the thing that got him into a lot of trouble, that he says, in one sense, the Quran is entirely the word of God, and in another sense, the Quran is entirely the word of Muhammad. And obviously, it's in a later essay that he explains that, what he really meant, and that is, excuse me?
This sounds Chalcedonian.
I think the Chalcedonian thing about the two natures of the Quran is basically the kalam lafzi, kalam nafsi. That's a different story. But Fazl Rahman builds on the kalam lafzi, nafsi question through intermediaries and interlocutors like Shah Waliullah and Ahmad Sirhindi and others, who basically state that these words and these sounds are already embedded in the mind of the Prophet. So the Prophet articulates that. And what he then says is that, when the man, he doesn't say, but I would elaborate, when the Prophet is angry with his wives, the revelation gets angry with him. When he is happy, the revelation becomes happy with him. When he is having certain kinds of doubts about himself, including the questions of, the Ayatul Qur'anic, the high-flying swans that Salman Rushdie, made famous through his satanic verses. And by the way, it seems that this theory, this as a question on the side, this idea of dealing with Muhammad both through his psychological experiences and his revelatory experiences has become kind of, neither Muslim scholars nor non-Muslim scholars want to touch that. Because after Salman Rushdie, who's going to talk about the Quran, right? So I think it's part of that kind of hesitation that people really don't want to dive into it. But I think it has a lot more offering there. So for instance, you can say, let me give you two examples, how one can build on that. Aisha says that she used to really find it offensive when women used to come to the Prophet and said, marry me. And she was really, found that difficult. And of course, at times he had to marry them because of, it might be somebody that he could not offend, from some tribe, whatever the context may have been. Until the revelation came down, tu'wi man tasha, that you can take, and the verse goes on, that you have the choice to choose whoever you want. This is Hadith Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, sorry. And then she tells him, Ara rabbaka yusari'u ila hawak. I saw that your Lord hastens to satisfy your desires. Okay? This is a very interesting way of understanding Revelation. The Prophet has to negotiate his what he has, and that brings in his psyche and so on and so forth. As you know, on other occasions there were kind of other developments. For instance, the Prophet, maybe I will use the example later.
May I interfere? But you've seen this trend really by many major or salient scholars who try just to focus on the Quran, excluding now the Hadith, the Seerah, and all the...
I think that's all wrong.
I understand this, but I'm curious to know from your evaluation or your analysis, why is this need to exclude everything and just focus on the Quran? Is it a lack of trust in anything else other than the Quran? We've seen this even with scholars who try to. Like if I mentioned the name Muhammad Shahrur, who said we just need mathematics and read the Quran and we have the result. So why do modernist Muslim scholars from the field, from outside the field, try really to exclude everything and just take the Quran as the book of investigation?
Yeah, I don't have I have some views on that. I don't have a study, but I think most people would be able to relate to what I'm going to say now. One is, I think, the context of modernity and the question of history. And I think for a long time, Muslims were capable of dealing with the question of tradition, and the authority of tradition worked for, by and large, with not much major schism. There is schism historically in Islam, Sunni Shia, Khawarij, Ibadis and others. But they could manage that schism through the authority of tradition. In other words, the grip that tradition had on their souls and on their bodies, on their political systems, and the question of empire. An empire and tradition molded and went along with the nature of the empire. I think come the conditions of modernity, tradition is under a lot of questioning. The question of science, for instance, and when people find hadith that says when you find a fly, dunk it in twice, find a fly in your soup, dunk it in twice and then drink it. Modern Muslims don't understand that, right? So that makes them doubt their prophet. How can that be scientific? I always tell such Muslims in a joking way, those were a species of Arabian flies that are no longer available. Evolution took care of that. And most of them are even more angry with me because I just introduced evolution. But the question really, but the most serious question is the question of history. So the modern Muslim wants a perfect Islam. The search for perfection becomes the problem that you need to have a history that fits in. So you have to remake the Prophet into a perfect being. His humanity must be excoriated from the narrative. The early companions must be made into paragons of perfection, and so on and so forth, and so that to the point that the tradition itself becomes sacred, whereas the tradition is not sacred. Authority has a certain kind of epistemic weight to it, but that is always subject to negotiation, and is always open to challenge, and so on. So I think that's the dilemma of the modern. I mean, nowadays you're finding studies that say that Banu Qurayza, or the execution and the event of Banu Qurayza, could not be possible in terms of the space in which the prisoners were held in Medina, for instance. So you're getting all kinds of, fly-by-night history that is being done, which is not really serious, in order to remake the past in terms of the present. So the answer to your question is, Islam is very much in a state of presentism, where the present dictates what the past must be. And so that past can be very easily altered and reshaped by ideologues and political movements and so on that have quite a force and in contention with which intellectuals have a hard time, because they also come with swords and daggers in terms of fatwas, of anathematizing and other kinds of things that push people out, and they come with a certain kind of power to make people like Amin al-Khuli lose his job, Ahmed Khalafallah never having a job, or Nasser Hamid Abu Zaid being subjected to takfir, and his marriage being dissolved. So that is the context in which we are working. Or even, I just heard that a scholar in Turkey who articulated this view that the Quran is using Fazl Rahman's idea, not Fazl Rahman's idea, but these are ideas that are part of the tradition. So part of the problem of history is also ignorance of tradition. Because the ignorance of tradition, you don't understand that tradition is also complex and is also multiple, that people don't get to that. So I don't want to take up all your time, but I think I can, if you have a further question, I'll be happy to entertain it.
I do indeed have a further question to you, and from what you observe, since you are all the time in the present auch in different contexts, not just only European context, but also in the Islamic world, in the Islamic context, Turkey, the Arab world, and
South Asia.
South Asia, exactly, not to miss anybody. How do you see the traditional camps who are trying to, or who sought or still seeking to reject all the contributions of the Muslim modernist scholars like Nasser Hamid Abu Zaid or the others? How do you estimate that? Do you think, are they engaging, or have they tried to engage in the ideas and methods and approaches proposed by these modernist scholars when it comes to reconstructing the Quran and make it relevant to a modern day? Or is it just a rejection just for the sake of rejection because they don't understand what is going on in terms of like change, history, and also change of realities?
I need to be careful not to paint with a very broad brush, but I think that it's safe to say in South Asia, for instance, among traditionalists of Deobandi, Barelvi, Ahlul Hadith, or Salafi groups and so on, they even have a difficulty with the interpretation of Maududi, for instance. They think that Maududi has taken too many liberties and so on. So many of them prefer to go with the kind of more traditional interpretation. So Nasser Hamid Abu Zaid, Khalafallah, and others are clearly out of range. Occasionally you might find people reading, because there's a preoccupation about the question of science and modern science, that Muslim theologians in South Asia are particularly interested, or Muslim theologians elsewhere, traditionalists. They find, for instance, Tantawi Johari's tafsir, for instance, very interesting, which is in some sense my first reading of Tantawi Johari is that it's full of kind of apologetics. There's a more constructive reading by another scholar whose article I've just begun. He thinks that Johari was trying to do something more than that, so I need to give attention to that. But the question really is that, these things are out of range, but that's also in the Arab Islamic world too. The traditionalists, prefer to stick to their Ibn Taymiyyah, but even though Ibn Taymiyyah has not written a tafsir, but his views count, or those of his students, Ibn Kathir and Fakhrul Razi to some extent, the more sophisticated ones and so on. Obviously, Tabari is a go-to for all. So the question really is that what I'm trying to do in a program that I've been doing for the last 5 years with recent madrasa graduates is to reintroduce madrasa graduates to the complexities of the Islamic tradition. One thing that they cannot reject is the tradition. Now, obviously, they have very selected ideas of tradition. They read in South Asia only the Hanafi tradition and a select version of the Hanafi tradition. So exposing them to Ibn Sina that they heard about but never studied. Shah Waliullah, whose name they heard but never read a page of him. So that's what I'm doing. They read the traditional madrasa textbooks on fiqh and hadith and those kind of things, but not the tradition. So the tradition is the key. So the answer to your quick question is, even among traditionalists, there's a huge ignorance of tradition. There's a massive ignorance of tradition, of all stripes, whether it's in Africa, the Middle East, or South Asia, or East Asia. And that is, I think, the way to make this question a little more complex, to get to grips with people who are very well intentioned and also resourced. They know Arabic, Urdu, Persian, all the classical languages and so on. They know very good Arabic, but it's exposure to the complex thinking of the tradition that they lack. Because what they've been given is a kind of a force-fed version of the tradition by which they can operationalize their daily lives. Going to the complex tradition means more questions and more personal discomfort. And the discomfort, most people don't like that.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, my next question goes to Felix. Yeah, Felix, we have a trouble here, and we need your help to assist us being an outsider, an insider somehow, sometimes. Throughout your work and also research in the area of hermeneutics, exegetical works in the area of Qur'anic studies, and also your exchange with Islamic theology or Muslim theologians in Germany. What are your impressions or remarks on the idea of reconstructing the context of the Quran in the modern time?
According to my perception, and obviously it's subjective and limited, but according to my perception, there has been a very interesting shift of focus in the last 20 years of exegesis of the Quran in the Muslim world, which has started to include also countries of German tongue. Yeah. The primary question I observed in my first years of research was, what does the Quran mean for today? And you mentioned Fazl Rahman, and it's quite understandable how many Turkish scholars, for example, flocked around him to understand him and accept him and apply him. So what does the Quran mean for today? Which methods do we have? Which hermeneutical tools can we apply? And more or less suddenly, I observed that this question moved out of fashion. I'm also trying to understand why. But it really triggered a redefinition of Quranic exegesis in the present era. The job description of tafsir even shifted, and people now quite broadly tell you the purpose of our work is to find out what did the first listeners of the Quran understand. Yeah? So that is why we seem to be gathering here, also this big project. This is all the question. If we want to know what the Quran means, we want to hear what the first listeners were understanding. Full stop. Now, this is very scholarly, and we have important support of the feasibility of such a project. Now even new support from German language scholars. But I would like to ask my Muslim friends and colleagues who do work on the Quran, do you really want to limit all your work, for the rest of your life and mine at least, to that question? Now I understand the question, what does the Quran mean for today, sounds much less attractive to people who work in countries where authoritarian regimes become more and more also the marking atmosphere for academia. If you do mathematics, you are safe also under Putin. And if you do what did the first listeners understand according to Al-Tabari, you are safe under anybody else. Yeah? But the second challenge that seems to lead to that focus on first listeners is, of course, theology has been much more taken for granted as an approach with its own methodology, a scholarship that has its respect until some decades ago. And now I think many of my colleagues need to show we are real scholars, we are scientific. So we heard the presentation just some hours ago, which a computer scientist and even a mathematician would probably approve of. I don't. Yeah? So second thing. And the third reason is, of course, some of those people who took part in this shift of focus also saw how easily the question, what does the Quran mean for today, can be abused. Yeah, I mean, you can say just anything. The Quran says this and it works. So, of course, abuse is also part of it. But if it is so easily instrumentalized, do invest time, work, thought, research on that so that it be not abused anymore. Now I'm saying something which comes from my Catholic experience. From about the 1940s on, and especially in the 1960s, a great rediscovery of scriptural studies became seminal for the existence of Catholicism in the present world. And it was a great liberation. It was interesting on all levels, from popular piety all the way up to discussions on concepts. Even what is a concept can, with contemporary biblical research, be redefined by saying, well, there's always something anticipating in a concept. As the kingdom of God is anticipated in Christ, so a concept is always also projecting something towards the future, and we have only an intuition of super interesting things. So the innovative, liberating, clarifying, also identity granting power of scriptural studies done with the question, and what does it mean for today, for us proved to be extremely fruitful. So I would say, do you really want to stick to that question? What did the first readers understand? It's a super question, but isn't there more?
Yeah, probably that.
I think one should bring in here the contribution of Mercator, who unfortunately cannot be among us today. She pointed out in her doctoral dissertation that, of course, trying to find out how the first audience of the Quran understood the preaching of the Prophet is basic for an adequate interpretation of any kind, but at the same time she showed that much of the transmitted information about this understanding of the first audience does in reality not go back to the first generation, but to the second one. Most of the isnads that are meant to give authority to these traditions concerning the original understanding are really not testimonies of those who really listened to the prophet. They are later. Not much later, but at least there is at least one generation between both instances. And she said, I think justly, that it becomes highly problematic if one identifies the understanding of the first listeners with what is universally valid as a correct understanding. Therefore, she pleaded for a rethinking of the whole concept of revelation, because she also observed that it is problematic if one closely looks at the way of interaction between the revealed speech and the questions and the whole situation of the first listeners, to keep to the conviction that the Quran really comes from a pre-existent, eternally fixed, heavenly original. So for her it's vital to try maybe to get a new, to come to a new understanding of the whole concept of relation, which was originally kept. So I think she would say, if she were present, that investigating the original understanding of the first audience is only the beginning of the whole process about which one must discuss.
Yeah, thank you very much. To your very challenging question, Felix, I would say, would you think that the question of authority plays a role here? Because trying to give a meaning of the text, try to give a meaning of the Quranic text, you always need to go back to who understood it first, or in what context the Quran came in, the first listeners of it. Because if I say, I'm Rana, I just read the Quran and I understood this and that, maybe only my friends would, maybe, I'm not really sure, would accept it. It's at the end of the day, it's my opinion. Yeah? But if I go back and I try to investigate what was actually the first understanding of Abu Bakr or Umar ibn al-Khattab to the Quranic verse, maybe then I could rely on his understanding and say, well, in the first generation who first heard the Quran, they immediately or later on understood that is the meaning what the Prophet wanted to say. So I have better cards to play than to say I'm the poor person who's just saying his opinion. So I'll be one of those who fell in the dalala way. Yeah.
I truly think that a question, what did the first generation understand, is a very important one. It is fundamental, as you rightly said. But we need to really try with all historical precision to find out whether it's really the first generation, and then nothing is answered. That is only what the first step of exegetical work is doing. And I really have lines of exegetes in the last 15 years who say then our job is done. And then they say, maybe some lawyers can then continue our work. But why are you giving this out of the hand? No, the exegetes and their work is then continuing. So I'm very much pleading for doing that historical, philological, semantic work, but then to continue it also as exegetes, also debating. But I also wanted to say in this context why the authority of the traditions should not be the only voice to be heard when trying to understand what the Quran really says. Because in the course of the last 300 years, we have also developed methods which shed light, not project something, shed light on the Quranic text. For example, a structural analysis of a surah. There are, you are right, some early exegetes who already look at structure, but contemporary research on intertextuality, for example, and structural observations also have a word to say here. So why exclude something that is really not Rana's opinion, but a way of discovering something that when you really apply it with people in a fairly objective setting, makes everybody say, right, this is not Rana, this is the Quran.
Do we have such scholars or maybe intellectuals who have done this task?
This task of what does Quran mean today?
No, not really. It's just not just only to be stuck in the first generation.
Yeah, I had some comments about how one thinks about the first generation. First of all, there was no book. It was an oral society. It was about a man and a mission. I think the whole idea of thinking through Islam through a book is highly problematic historically. And it's what this man who is struggling so hard to be heard and no one wants to hear him. And his success comes really at the end of his prophetic career, with lots of ups and downs and successes and failures. And I think we need to go beyond the kind of romantic Muslim understanding that all these wars were great victories. Of course, they were victories, but what does it mean? Did they become millionaires overnight? No, it was overrunning an adversary and then getting some gain and so on and so forth. So I think that's the first question about this. The other question is about that community and that community and its norms and its values that must be deeply studied in order to really understand what that original impetus was. Because the problem is that one can easily back project on that original community our contemporary understanding. So in other words, how does one do that work with a certain element of this historical, be dispassionate about it, and a certain amount of whatever objectivity means, but a certain amount of distance from that. In order to grasp that understanding, even if that understanding really might not work today. And by the way, I'm not the first one to say this. In his very early career and studying the Quran, Sayyid Qutb, for instance, says that the first iteration and expression of Islam is not its last expression. That brings me to the question, the modern understanding of origins and authenticity. I think the modern understanding of authenticity is to identify origins. So this obsession with origins then creates that if the origins are not there, then whatever subsequently is then a forgery or false. That was not how Muslims understood it historically. The Prophet is hardly died And Omar says, I'm not distributing the spoils of war amongst the fighters anymore. It's a Quranic verse. On a whole range of other issues, they have a certain kind of consensus of among themselves that for some time that they will not be selling al-Walad, that is the mothers that gave birth to children, slave women, they will not be sold. Toward the end of his career, Ali says they can be sold, with the result that the idea of ijma' was shattered. So there is no ijma' on that. That then basically is the ijtihad of Omar. In other words, what I'm saying but this very idea that Omar is instituting a different kind of practice of what the Prophet did shows you that they didn't work from a strict script, but they worked from what Fazl Rahman talks about, the elan, a certain kind of force and a momentum. And that force and momentum is about God, this man, and that community. And the more we know about that man, the better in the original understanding. Now, we will not be able to change the man, but our historical understanding of the man will change. Our historical understanding of that community historical understanding will change, because we are children born in the bowels of history. Our concept of history, because of modernity, is a very different understanding of history compared to that of, say, Ibn Khaldun or other historians before that. History is a very different ballgame. It's all about the making of the human being in the present and his or her needs for that understanding. So when you say, when they listen to Muhammad's speech, or Walid bin Mughira saying that, wow, there's something to this. I don't know, but there's something to the speech. It is this man, he has a sense of poetry, he has a sense of folklore, that is, what's his name, Walid bin Mughira. He understands that there's something special about this. Same thing with Omar. Omar was among the few who could read and write. Omar, when he hears the first speech, it stirs something in him. In other words, because he's familiar with the history of that community. And he understands that this is a new impetus coming in, that this man, that we have not recognized for a long time, but he's saying something interesting. He is our foe politically, if he wants to go meet this man, right? So I think you need to understand the historical possibilities and what these people have. Abu Bakr, so what did you asked the question, what did Abu Bakr or Omar mean? They basically said, we're seeing here a charismatic figure. He's not entirely a poet, he's not a soothsayer, he's not a magician, he's something that connects to maybe what the Jewish prophets were. Maybe, I'm not sure. I mean, there are many other authorities here that can detail that. But clearly they can detail that to the Arab prophets, Shu'aib and Hud, they remember that history. So maybe he's making that kind of connection, right? Not Shu'aib, sorry, Ad and Thamud, Saleh, sorry, that's right. So I think those kind of questions that we need to think about historically. As to what is the present will put its own kind of demands. And it will not be a copy of the past. The present will be a very different story. And that is the difficulty when people have been raised on the diet of religion that must be a carbon copy of the past. When you're raised on that kind of diet, it becomes extremely difficult to now relate that what you say is Islam doesn't look exactly like a carbon copy that you're looking for. Yes, there will be a prophet, there will be a Quran, there will be a tradition. But the meanings and understandings of what work of that prophet is going to be effective now, today and tomorrow, is going to be a very different story. And for that, you need to develop a certain kind of, dispensation, a kind of moral and ethical and spiritual dispensation. That is one thing that the history of Sufism teaches you, and also the history of Kalam, that Muslims altered their understandings of certain doctrines through Kalam. That was not the origins. For instance, it's very late in my career that I discovered, when political Islamists talk about, the first thing they talk about, non-Muslims will be made dhimmis, and dhimmis are going to pay jizya. Well, when you read Taftazani in the 14th century, Taftazani says, and his commentator Khayali, and his later commentator in the 17th, 18th century India, C. Al-Koti, they say that, jizya is a choice of the imam. It's not obligatory. None of the political Islamists tell you that story. Right? So people are raised on a very false diet, but this Muslim traditionalists in the past, and scholars that are recognized, argue that even though Quran is very clear that the jizya must be an yadin wa hum saghirun, right? It has a particular way in which it articulates that. So I think this question of understanding what the present is, and a negotiation with questions of value, so on. So I think that the question of authenticity today, it's a Heideggerian inspiration, but authenticity today is responsibility. What is responsibility? What is amana? Right? The Muslim classical scholars talked about amanatul ilm. The whole Islamic project is based upon amana, vicegerency, right? Responsibility. So what is that responsibility? That requires a certain articulation in conversation with tradition, with history, with the original community. But that picture might look very different from that picture of origins. With all due respect to those who work on origins, they must continue to do their work, but it will have a certain kind of role to make us understand what those origins were, and maybe the impulse, the momentum becomes much more clearer, and the echo becomes much more profound.
But do you think now, if we take the context here in Germany, as you know that now in Germany we have Islamic theology centers, we have Muslim students who study Islamic theology, so they get different disciplines within the Islamic theology, the larger field of study. But then the study of Quran, Quranic text sciences. So where to begin? If we to produce new or to open new doors for students of Islamic theology to explore the study of Quran, different from that what they learned at the mosque or at home, or from the text they read from back home if they come from like countries outside Germany. Where to begin?
Where to begin? I don't shy away from trying an answer because I'm also practical in many ways, and this is also my business, so I'm quite happy to make a fool of myself. So I've already there are several questions. The one question that I've labored enough is the question of history. I'm not going to touch that right now. I think the biggest question for the audience that you're talking about and everything that you just said, I accept that, is the question of the epistemological question. The epistemological question is the million-dollar question for practitioners and for believers and for communities that take Islam seriously. And that is a challenge. A certain set of Muslim practitioners and believers and so on don't want their tradition to be what they call corrupted by the modern epistemic tradition. In other words, an insider of philosophy, of history, of sociology shall never ever intertwine and interlocute with the historical understanding of the Quran, language debates, and a whole range of issues that do with the Quran, tafsir, hadith, and so on and so on. They don't want that kind of interlocution to take place. The more I remind those audiences that what you call your grand Islamic tradition is a combination of Persianate, Greek traditions that you call ilm al-kalam, even some Indic materials and so on, that has been built into it, they think that, I'm joking with them or they're not serious. But because it's been so Islamized and so on, they fear the kind of, the modern tradition because they feel that it's going to be corrupting. But that is exactly where the epistemic debate should be. What does a new epistemological framework look like by which scholars will with all due diligence and coherence and all the good things that needs to go into it, be able to engage in? Because, look, Ibn Sina and Farabi is very interesting as historical philosophers, even Mullah Sadra. But what is the philosophical impetus the world living today of a cosmos that is continuously expanding, we have the web now. The Webb telescope is 1 million miles away, and we're seeing a nature of the cosmos that is beyond our solar system. We can now see beyond our solar system. That is unthinkable in the past, where cosmology, the cosmos was always closed. It was an open-ended cosmology, the question of human origins. And where do we come from? What is our relationship to animals? What's the relationship to the environment and so on? So these are the big questions by which you will have to engage in the disciplines of today, and as a scholar of the Quran. In other words, you will have to have a sense of history, not the way Ibn Khaldun understood it, but the way in which modern historians understand themselves, if you want to serve these audiences. If you want to serve audiences 500 years ago, then continue with that. Good luck.
I think this is not our goal, but
No,
I know, but the mission is very difficult, speaking from experience. I think my colleagues who are also teaching in the field, they know with whom they are going to engage with. It's going to be a hard task, but I'm optimistic that maybe in the future we will be able to.
Let me just add one thing. So there are a lot of scholars who are quite happy to work outside of and just work with their kind of traditional ways of doing things. But the problem that you're going to get is, and look, it's trouble to do what I'm suggesting. You're inviting a lot of trouble for yourself. You're going to be subject to a lot of questioning. So if you want to get into this business the way I'm articulating, you must develop a thick skin, number one. And you need to be able to bounce off attacks and so on, and other things. No, I forgot my train of thought, but you will come back.
I think everything will come back again. I think we have now the time and open the door for questions from the audience. And we will need to finish today at 7 o'clock, so we have almost half an hour for questions and remarks. I see a few hands being raised up. The gentleman here, please.
Thank you very much, Ibrahim Musa. I will ask a question. When I read the idea of Fazlur Rahman about the revelation, really I couldn't understand. If we think that logically or philologically there is no difference between meaning and word, lafz and mana, it is impossible. How can we say that verses, revelation at the same time to God and to Muhammad? And some words in Baqarah Surah, I couldn't understand, I couldn't remember really, but he said that man adu Jibril, adu Allah. And
Man kana aduwan li Jibril fa'inahu.
Yeah, and who nazzala
ala qalbi.
ala qalbik. The verse is open. How can we understand, try to say Fazlur Rahman about the revelation? My question.
What do you want me to answer?
Shall we take a few questions and then you answer them? Is better. Eric is there, and also here in the front there's a question. Yeah.
Thank you. I have two small, short comment on presentation of Brother Ibrahim Musa. First, generalizations are not inescapable in scientific writings, but bold generalization, big generalization, very dangerous. Contextualization is very important as to the Fazlur Rahman and Godzihar and the Quran. To understand the Quranic text, we need to know context or contextualize the Quranic text. Also, same thing is true about Fazlur Rahman. If you look at the past history of Fazlur Rahman in Pakistan, building of Pakistan, you can understand why Fazlur Rahman insisting on such issues with such a perspective because they want to build a modern Islamic state in Pakistan. That is why, for same reason, Ahl Quran in India subcontinent also, they want to insist on the importance of the Quran as a only authentic text in front of to defend Islam in front of Jewish or Christians, Britain and Buddhists or others. So first thing we must to do to understand all these people.
Could you just directly say your question?
Yes, as to the Ghazi also, Dr. Ibrahim said that Fazlur Rahman ignored traditions. I am not agree with him if I am not wrong, because yes, Ghazi also in their some statements they are saying as if they are ignoring all the traditions. But when we contextualize Ghazi and Fazlur Rahman, we understand, we see clearly that especially Fazlur Rahman and Ghazi, their problem with polemical traditions only. I wrote about Ghazi more than 300 pages in my website. You can say some of them in Turkish, some of them in Arabic.
I think your point is
yes, so we need to contextualize all of the authors and other texts.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think the question has been understood. We have here a question and then Armina, please. Yeah.
There's some other people in the panel also.
Then thank you very much for this sitting, very enjoyable, and I want to say something to my close friend Felix Kerner. We are not going back to the first 3 centuries of Islam to escape. Believe me, inside the reports, many things provoking, most provoking and bravery interpretation of the Quranic text against the classical Islamic understanding. Believe me. As far as I know, inside the encyclopedia of Musaid Tayyar's, for example, 64,000 reports, we are facing many provoking and giving encourage to change something about the literacy, about the Quranic text, about something. Not for escaping. That is the new one. Believe me, and wait a little bit. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you very much, all the panelists, for giving us or providing these spotlights on different issues of what is currently debated in terms of the importance of the Quran for Muslim identity or for understanding of Islam, I would say. I have to apologize to Professor Wieland and Professor Körner that I will have to direct my question again to Ibrahim. It is a mixture of a comment, observation, and a question. I do understand, and I do share your views and your criticism of Fazlur Rahman and of many different, let's say, modes of modernists dealing with Islamic traditions. I think, we are 40 years past that, we are well into postmodernity. We know the difficulties with these perspectives and methodologies and so on. I do completely understand the problematics, and I do also treat that in my classes as a problem, the focusing and the centering of Muslim thoughts on the times of origin and all the problematics that this has. But then again, we deal with Islamic intellectual history at a German university of today in a deconstructivist way. So when you mention Ibn Sina and his cosmology and the others, of course we deconstruct that. We say these are the ulama of the Middle Ages and of pre-modernity, but we have to read them discursively, we have to deconstruct them. So there is nothing or not much left of that thought. So then we go back. We have to deconstruct the hadith. So again, you have deconstructed that. And the students, and I think they have right, they ask in the end, what is it that remains? What is it in the end? If we also deconstruct the Quran, and as a discourse, and what is it actually that remains, that makes us Muslim, that constitutes our Islamicity, and that makes us Islamic? So if everything is dissoluted in history, I think that the search, so it's not just the need for some mythological or let's say for some past grandeur that is motivating people. It's also the need somehow to transgress the contingency that we have when basically dealing with everything in this, let's say, scientific, historical way. So what is it at the end that remains? That would be my question as to your personal view.
Should we try to...
I think we go to the answer directly, and if there are other questions, then we take them. Yeah.
You know, my two colleagues should also jump in if they think that they can help me out. These are tough questions. Let me start from Almina's question. The question is, first of all, let me state, I'm hugely indebted to Fazl Rahman. I'm hugely indebted to Fazl Rahman. I mean, I owe a lot to Fazl Rahman just in terms of the wake-up call that his writings gave to me, and I used him a great deal. And I do still use him, but I have some disagreements. So I was not his direct student, but I was his oasis student. I was his long-distance student, right? I mean, so in that sense. The question that you ask is what one of my Stanford students many years ago told me. You know, once I took your class, you completely dismantled my innocent faith in Islam. You dismantled my innocent faith in Islam. I yearned for that. Well, I told him I also yearned for that innocent faith I had as a 16, 17-year-old who went to India, but I had many more questions. And therefore, I could not deal with this innocence because I had a world that I had to deal with. I have racism in the country of my origins. I have a global situation in which I am a part of, and I want to work in that world from my tradition, and therefore I need to understand my tradition historically. I could have been a secularist, I could have been a Marxist, I could have been whatever I wanted. But I self-identify as a critical Muslim, right? As a Muslim who lives in a modern world, who is indebted to my history. That is my identity. Islam is my primary identity marker. So, what is left? A lot is left. You have history, you have architecture, you have a huge 1400-year history that are all markers of a community of faith that built multiple civilizations across East and West and Southern and in Africa, and hardly a place of the world left untouched. But I think your question is...
That's again national romanticism, isn't it?
No. I mean, you can use it as a romance history, but you can also have a critical history of that. But I think your question is about what is left of faith. But faith is nothing to do. You can have an informed faith, and therefore you need to tell your student, if you are interested in an informed faith, then you have to go through rigors and some psychological and emotional shifts in your understanding of the innocence of the Prophet, in the innocence of the Medina and Meccan society, the innocence of Islamic history. That is what you're coming to this class for, to shake off that innocence, to understand the complexity and the way in which history comes with warts and all. So what is left? But faith is a different story. And if you want to build a faith based on some kind of framework, of epistemic framework of Ghazali's faith, or Ibn Taymiyyah's faith, or even Ibn Sina's faith and so on, those are people that battled with ideas. And through their battle with ideas, they could make a claim to a faith that was different from the woman in the village or the man in the village in Khorasan at that time, or my faith is very different from my grandmother's faith, who was illiterate, but she had faith. Okay? So I think what is left is a question of anxiety. And this anxiety is not only a Muslim question, it's everybody's question. And everybody who are people of tradition, they have anxieties. And so maybe our colleagues can inform us further. Let me just answer.
I think there's a point here.
Intersection.
Yeah, intersection, yeah.
Only a small remark. I would like to come back to the question of Amina America. When you say well, the central point is anxiety, which is not only that of Muslims today, or the whole thing is about responsibility and finding out what responsibility means nowadays. As long as you want to make Muslim, to engage in Muslim theology, or confess that your creed is Islamic, I think you must be able to give the reason why you are keeping exactly to the Quran. You cannot risk to get into a situation where this basis becomes exchangeable for anything. So I think there must still be some sort of a concrete attachment to this very basis. Otherwise, well, you can exchange this religious creed for some type of philosophy or anything else. So I think this is the point you wanted to make.
Well, I respectfully have a different position. Muslims were never worshippers of the Quran. Muslims never worshipped the Quran. No, but Muslims, Islam is not about the Quran alone. Islam is something much more complex. And it's about the prophetic hadith, it's about the sunnah, it's about tradition, it's about interpretation. That's what Islam is. This is a very modern way of articulating. This is almost a Protestant way of understanding Islam. That Islam is all about the Quran. So many Muslims have already become Protestant. I agree. Many Muslims have already become Protestant because of the modern impulse, and therefore, I mean, we talk about, in the hermeneutics of Islamic thought, we talk about isharatun nas, dalalatun nas, iqtida'un nas, the implications of a text, the signification of a text, the nuances of a text. I said modern Muslims have added a fourth dimension, ibadatun nas, the worship of the nas. That is not historically what Muslims have been doing. That is not the historical Muslim story. Muslims understand the text in the world. And this text, whether the Quranic text or the prophetic text, at least that's what I understand by studying for most of my life the Islamic historical tradition. So this question about this relatedness, but the Quran becomes part of the mix, but it doesn't have the answers. What modern Muslims want, that the Quran must have all the answers. And maybe that is Armenia's question, but the answers on it. But let me answer Professor Ilhami and Professor Khairi's questions.
Yeah, but just a second. I just, you still have the chance to respond to the statement of Ibrahim Musa. I don't want to take it away from you.
I think there is no necessity to adore a text. That's really not the Muslim position. It is not the Quranic text which is adored. This would really be un-Islamic. But on the other hand, as long as you want to understand yourself as a Muslim, I think you must be able to say why you are keeping exactly to this tradition and not to another one.
I don't disagree with you. There's no disagreement.
No, by tradition I understand something that is really living, that develops toward the future, that defines itself anew, where one sees the necessity for that. But nevertheless, you must still be able to say why you think there is a normative basis of any kind in this basic text of reference. Otherwise, I don't see how you want to justify your conviction that you are still continuing Islam as a factor of your identity?
Let me answer that first. 1400 years of Islamic jurisprudence teaches me that Muslim jurists never took every verse of the Quran literally for normativity. It's always part of a complex interpretation. And it's so yes, of course the Quran is normative, but normativity, let me rephrase. The Quran has elements of normativity in it. And that's only a small portion of it. The majority of it is what we do call, the Haggadah. It's stories, it's about narratives and so on, and you know that better than I would. So I'm not going to labor that point. But the question of normativity, what is the normativity? The normativity of the Quran, the central thing is that there is this man who is God's emissary and messenger with whom you need to connect. If you connect to this book, you are connected because you understand his authenticity. It's Muhammad's authenticity. Ghazali 101 tells you that the first thing that you do, why you need falsafatul ula, why you need first philosophy, is to verify the status and authority of this man through reason. After that, that man can tell you everything that is unreasoned and non-reasonable, you buy into it. Okay? But it goes through that authority. Now comes to this question here, so I don't understand the disagreement or what I'm saying that is remarkably different from what the tradition is saying. The second point is that Professor Ilhami and Professor Khairi's question. I think Professor Khairi, I understand the context of Fazl Rahman's Pakistan. First of all, I never said that he doesn't buy into tradition. Fazl Rahman is clear, very clear. He has bought into a certain amount of Shah and Gulzar's understanding about this question of fabrication, but he disagrees with both of them. But his clear point in Islamic methodology and history, which is a very, very important text, he tries to argue that this question of that the important thing for Muslim is Sunnah, and the Sunnah has to be constructed through a sophisticated epistemological process in order to extrapolate the Sunnah from the existing materials, which is the Hadith materials. But the Hadith materials cannot be taken on their face value. They must be subjected to a historical scrutiny beyond what the Muhaddithin do. That part he did it through the examples that he gave in Islamic methodology and history to show on a whole range of issues. He subsequently also done that on the question of riba, when he argues that riba is very different from modern usury and so on, very controversial. So Fazl Rahman does accept the authority of the Sunnah, but the authority of the Sunnah is developed through the study and the hermeneutics of the Hadith. That's the first thing. And so I did not say he ignored tradition. As to Professor Ilhami's question, I think it's Professor Ilhami, right? Yeah. We've seen each other, but I've never greeted you or spoken to you the many times I've come to Ankara. So very kind of you to ask a question. I think Fazl Rahman's argument. Look, the question that any reasonable auditor of the Prophet want to know, where do you get all the stuff from? Where do you get this stuff from that you're telling us? Right? How come one day you could not say anything articulate and suddenly you said, God inspired me. Iqra bismi rabbika alladhi khalaq. Khalaqa al-insana min alaq. Iqra wa rabbuka al-akram. Suddenly you're talking this kind of language? Were you now subject to some sorcery? Were you subject, did someone do something to you, right? Those were the first charges that were made to him. So the reasonable question is, how does this happen to you, right? And how does this happen? So Fazl Rahman says that the traditional Muslim understanding that the Prophet is merely a postbox in which messages get deposited doesn't really work, and is also not consistent with the historical understanding of the tradition. And therefore he argues, and I just reread the chapter in Major Themes of the Quran last night on Revelation and Prophecy. He says that in all the occasions that the Prophet is inspired by Angel Gabriel, is as a Rasul, Gabriel is a Rasul and an emissary, hardly Malak, not a Malak, not a Malak, not an angel. And he also thinks that this idea of Rasul works in different ways. It's through a certain kind of intuition that the Prophet is not necessarily that, certain words are uttered to him. And as you well know, that Fazl Rahman says that the classical Muslim theory could not in one complete way say that the Quran is entirely the word of God and at the same time also the uttered words of Muhammad. So when you say the distinction between lafz and ma'na, you know that the first challenge early Islam faced on this question of the revelation of the Quran is that how can you say that this book between two covers is the word of God? How can you say it is a word, kalamullah? How can you say it is a kalamullah? If you say God is ineffable, God cannot speak, if God does not incarnate in the world, how can you make the argument that this is God's incarnate word? So Muslim theologians had to develop a question of kalam lafzi and kalam nafsi, that backed up that the psychic speech, the hidden speech, versus the kalam lafzi, the verbal speech. That the verbal speech is an echo of the kalam nafsi that is in the Lawh Mahfuz, in the heavenly tablet, right? So that's what had to come, and that's I think what we were referring to earlier, is that in some ways it is almost a copycat idea of the two natures of Christ, right? They embody the body and the spirit and so on. So Muslims had to do that. So Fazl Rahman argues, that is one argument, and you know that this question of kalam nafsi, kalam lafzi is a very, very complex argument. Even someone there's been a recent republication of a 16th, 17th century Kurdish scholar, Ibrahim al-Qurani's work on this question of, is kalam al-nafsi qa'imun bidatillah? And if someone says that this kalamullah is qa'imun bidatihi, and if someone disagrees with it, can you make takfir of that person? Ibrahim al-Qurani says you cannot. Okay? So the question is that you cannot identify the verbal speech with the essence of God and with the person of God per se. So Fazl Rahman, and I know the chairman wants me to finish off. So we can talk later on if you want to discuss this further. But Fazl Rahman does argue that the way in which the Prophet received it, that the words, the sound words that we are articulating, Bismillah, right? Those sounds come from Muhammad's tongue, from his mind. But something inspires him to say Bismillah and not some other phrase, right? And so Fazl Rahman is very clear that the Quran is entirely the word of God through inspiration, but entirely the word of Muhammad through articulation. Because it's not the angel that articulated it to us. It's Muhammad who articulated it to us. And several subsequent Quranic readers. I mean, for me, it's the most common sense and logical understanding to do that. But I think because Muslims have been fed on this diet, reverence for the book of the Quran is there. I mean, Muslims don't kick around the Quran, don't treat the Quran with disrespect, treat the Quran because it is after all kalam lafzi, but it's related to kalam nafsi. So that doesn't mean that in any way it diminishes of the Quran. Rather, it makes the Quranic story a much more fascinating one.
Yeah, I think we will leave it here, but we have said question in the audience. Ufuk has it. Okay, it's gone. Okay, behind you there is behind you, and then next to you there is another question.
I have a simple question for Professor Felix. If I understood correctly, Professor Felix, that the Muslims are mainly focused on the first generation understanding of the Quran and are maybe afraid to say something new about the Quran understanding. And the most important thing is to focus on what Quran means to Muslim in modern times. And my question is what he thinks by his Catholic understanding Quran means to Muslims today, and what should Muslims do in this case? I think it's a very simple question, but I'm curious about his personal opinion. Thank you.
Could we take the next and last question, and then we end with Felix this session? Yeah.
My question is maybe simple, but difficult. I would like to ask Professor Wieland if she wrote a book that is predicting for the next century what tafsir is going to do. What would that book look like?
Also, Sie soll ein Buch schreiben, das Islam in der Zukunft exegetisch macht. Also, ob Sie das voraussagen können.
Well, I think it's not my role to give advice in this respect. This is a matter of the self-determination of Muslim theologians. I think there are certain important points to be kept in mind for the future. The first one is to try to be intellectually sincere in a very general sense. That means admitting that there are problems. For instance, what concerns the understanding of nature and universe. If one tries to bring this in accordance with pertinent Quranic statements, this doesn't mean that Quranic statements are to be considered as wrong, but it is clear that certain traditional understandings cannot be kept anymore. For instance, denying evolution is intellectually insincere nowadays. This cannot be done. So one must develop new ways of understanding of what is said in the Quran, and there are even already approaches in the late 19th century that can show a certain kind of way to a solution in this respect. For instance, when Sheikh Hussein al-Jisr, well-known Syrian scholar of the late 19th century, said, well, at that time he was not yet convinced that evolution is really more than a theory, which we know nowadays. It's a reality. But when he said, should it turn out sometime that Darwin's theory, or much more than Darwin nowadays, is true, then this will necessitate a new interpretation of the pertinent Quranic statements. But as long as one keeps to the conviction that God is the creator of everything, in which sense whatsoever, one remains a Muslim. This is such a way that can be followed, or a direction in which one can continue thinking. This to the point of intellectual sincerity. And another wish for the future is that Islamic theology should take advantage of the specific situation of the diaspora, in which some impediments to consequent theological thoughts that exist in many Islamic countries really are not existent to the same extent. In many Islamic countries, you have a very problematic symbiosis between political authorities and rather traditional list theological approaches. Here in Germany, and also in other European countries, if one is lucky, one can really try to develop theological approaches without interference of political authorities. And I think it would be very important that the seminal approaches that can develop on this new basis here become really known in the countries of Muslim majority. That means that one should avoid to form some sort of an insula of diaspora theology and try to make known the new ideas and approaches one has developed in this diaspora context in the countries of Islamic majority as much as this is possible, so that a real discussion can take place and the circle of those acquainted with new approaches is widening. I still remember a very problematic remark of Muhammad Arkoun, the well-known scholar of Algerian origin, who also developed some really interesting and thought-provoking ideas about interpreting the Quran. He once complained that his ideas don't have any impact on Islamic theology in general. And he found out the reason for that, because he said the main problem is that the Arabs cannot read French. I think that's the wrong way to try to solve the problem. Scholars working now in Europe and developing new theological ideas should themselves try to make their own ideas known in the languages of Muslim majority. This is very important.
Felix, if you could summarize your answer just shortly before we finish.
Thanks very much for the question. Maybe it will be a final word. Of course, short answers are always dangerous answers. But if they are suggestive, not finishing, but starting a course of reflection, then they may be helpful. So I don't tell you what I spontaneously say now, but what I used to teach when I was in Rome. For 11 years I taught future leaders of the Catholic Church, Catholic theology, and we also had a course in theology of religions discussing Islam, and I used a formula there, a Latin formula, of course, that I translated. Comparing the fundamental liturgies, worships, you could say what really Christianity wants to be is communio Dei, which means God's communion in the double sense. He is offering us his own life, and we are sharing in it, and thus we are creating the people of God, communio Dei. Islam's fundamental liturgy, if you want to say that, is the namaz, the salat, whatever you want to call it, which in its structure is that of an audience. The Lord is receiving us who are standing in his service, and we are being confronted with him and by him in a very good sense. So confrontatio Dei, in the sense God is inviting you to serve and is asking you the question whether you are faithfully serving. The whole idea of Islam, according to my reading of the Quran, is you are being asked, even now, a question to which you have to answer. The word of being asked in most of our languages is mas'uliyah, yeah? We are sorumlu, yeah? We are verantwortlich, we are responsible. So the call of the Quran is to live in the faith of the Lord whom we are serving as responsible servants, because we have to respond to his invitation and his question, who are you, my servant?
Thank you, Felix. We have maybe less than a minute. Ibrahim Musa would like to say.
It'll be a long minute, but let me just thank you for chairing this, man, and coping with me, which that's really great on your part. Just a couple of things. To Professor Almina's question, what is the Quran? The Quran, no, no. I mean, I want to say this for those who might misunderstand. The Quran is a grand narrative of a messenger's journey in this world and that communication with heaven. And it is summed up in the verse of the throne, Allahu la ilaha illa huwal qayyum, the living God, and what you commit, وَقَالُوا سَمِعْنَا وَأَطَعْنَا. And they say, we hear and we obey. It's about a set of obediences, okay? It's not the obediences of the fiqh, that of which some verses in the Quran, there are some verses of fiqh. Those normative verses are subject to interpretation from day one, as I already elaborated, and if you're still not convinced, I have more time to talk to you afterwards. The second question is that I think Professor raised a major question here on this question of evolution and so on. And it may be, is exactly what I said about the question of the theology of today will have to be understanding the world in which we live and how to articulate that. And maybe it will be worth looking into the ideas of Ibn Sina, who talked about that the idea of faith, of emanation from the first, right? The way he understood it, min al-awwal, emanation. Could that also be an idea of creation? But I don't want to go into kind of, creationism. Lastly, two more points. One, lastly, is that for Ibn Sina, Ghazali, and Muhyiddin Ibn al-Arabi, for all of them, revelation at its core is based on imagination, on khayal. They've articulated that quite explicitly. That is, the Quran is an invitation to imagination. If you understand it in one way, through story, through history, through a variety of entry points. The only person who disagrees with this is Ibn Taymiyyah, who critically took on Ghazali, Ibn Arabi and others to say, for him it is obedience to the text. And that's where the difficulty comes in. I think Ibn Taymiyyah is brilliant, and very, very brilliant, so I'm not making him a scapegoat for all this that people say Salafism comes from Ibn Taymiyyah. No. Salafism comes from the contemporary conditions and the kind of narratives Muslims want. And finally, I might have to disagree with a professor here again. There is no Muslim diaspora. Muslims are here to stay. And they will have to work in America. My son is married to a man who is of Polish background. My daughter in America, my son is married to my daughter is married to someone of Polish background, Polish American. My daughter is married to somebody who is of Midwestern origin. They are all happy Muslims in a variety of ways. And so there is no diaspora. What it really means is that Muslims need to work whether here or there. I also don't think that there are political conditions preventing, except in the case of Nasser Hamid Abu Zaid, but many other people are doing very, very serious work in Turkey, in Egypt and other places without publicizing it. Part of Nasser's problem was that he went to throw the whole file and gave it to the journalists. And then it became part of the daily story. So I think there is lots of creative work happening there too, but I think the opportunity to discuss that publicly is obviously not
I think we do have the opportunity in the evening to discuss all the points that we discussed today. Just a very important point before we end. All guests who have been traveled to come to the conference and they are part of the conference, please, you find the form in the paper folder here. Please fill the form and sign it and give it back to the team here, so you're sure to get your money back, to be refunded. And you, for the speakers today and also all the participants in the conference, you're welcome, ahlan wa sahlan, for our evening dinner. It will be a barbecue, if I'm not... barbecue and vegetarian and non-vegetarian food, so you will find everything in the outside. You just follow everybody, and I wish you a guten Appetit. Vielen Dank, thank you very much.